Just to start with as well, I'd like to say a huge thank you not only to the co-authors listed up here and our partners, but also the army of interns, students, and assistants that have all worked on this project over the last 5 years. It's been a lot of time underwater collecting data and inputting data and analyzing data. So a huge thank you to everybody. So just to start with, to take you all back underwater for a moment, here we have the invasive lionfish. I'm sure you've all seen them. They're a beautiful but invasive predatory fish. Originally from the Indo-Pacific, where there are actually 12 species of lionfish, they were all imported into the Western Atlantic through the aquarium trade, where they were released off the coast of Florida. This happened or was first noticed back in the 1980s, and we saw a spread along the eastern seaboard. In the early 2000s, that spread had rapidly invaded the Caribbean basin. And today we see lionfish, and of course in 2004 we saw lionfish first appear in the Bahamas, just off of New Providence, in fact. Now we have lionfish not just extensively throughout the Caribbean basin, but also as far down as Brazil. So they've been a perfect invader and a huge invader, and there's lots of reasons for that. They're a habitat generalists, meaning that they're very unfussy about where they live. You'll find them in the reefs, seagrass, mangrove beds, and you'll also find them across a huge depth range, anywhere from 1 to 1,000 feet. There's a lack of disease and parasites for lionfish here in the Western Atlantic, and they're also incredibly good at reproduction. So they mature at an early age. This lionfish here, the scale is in centimeters, so just a few centimeters long, but within a year of its life, it will be able to reproduce. When lionfish reproduce, they produce an egg mass of some 20,000 eggs. Under the right conditions, a lionfish can reproduce every 4 days. So an individual has the potential of producing 2 million eggs a year. Finally, there's a lack of biocontrol for lionfish, a lack of predation. This video was shot in the Indo-Pacific, where, of course, lionfish do have predators. They have stresses, evolutionary constraints and stresses of life, competition, disease, and parasitism. Of course, here in the Caribbean, the Western Atlantic, those stresses are removed. It's much like being on spring break, an all-inclusive holiday. The only things to worry about is feeding and reproduction. So what we know about lionfish. This graph just shows the number of publications over the last couple of decades. And you can see that the increase in publications has been dramatic. The two colors there just denote whether the publication was related to its native range or the invaded range. But either way, we know a lot more about lionfish. We know how incredibly detrimental lionfish have been to the reefs. And there's shocking figures like these, where they reduce the recruitment on a reef by up to 80% and the biomass by up to 50%. However, there is much we still don't know. Things like how the removal of the native species in turn affects the reef itself. So in terms of coral cover and algae cover. And to understand this, you really need a very long-term monitoring program. So this is the Cape of Eleuthera, where CEI is based. Unfortunately for us, back in 2009, 2 projects were started. So there was Dr. Stephanie Green was starting her PhD work, and of course the MT Isaac work was started in collaboration and partnership with the DMR and the BNT and other Caribbean countries. And these projects laid the groundwork for our long-term monitoring project. And they were very interested in answering questions that would be useful for resource managers, such as how many lionfish can a reef really support? How many do you have to remove to have a positive impact on the native fish that are there? So this graph looks kind of complicated, but just focus on the top 2 lines there. Those 2 lines represent removals on reefs where all or the majority of the lionfish were removed. And you can see over a 2-year period that there was a positive increase in the prey biomass on those sites. So we know we need to remove most or all of the lionfish to have a positive impact. Additionally, they asked questions about how often you have to go back and remove these fish, which is a key piece of information for conservation managers, how you can get the most bang for your buck. So the green dots here show non-removal reefs where the lionfish were left, and the red dots show full removals. And you can see over the months that the dots join again after a 4-month period. So we knew recolonization was happening about every 4 months. So in 2011-12, we decided to continue monitoring these reefs that have been part of this long-term study. We took a subset of these reefs, so instead of using the full 32 that had been involved in these studies, we had 16. 8 reefs where we removed all the lionfish, and 8 reefs where we left the lionfish. So we went every 3 months to do these removals on half of the sites. On all of the sites, every 3 months, we conducted fish transects. These patches are rather small, so the transect was just 8 meters long, a belt transect where we counted all the fish. We also conducted roving diver surveys to count the total number of lionfish on the patches and the amount of competitors as well, so things like groupers. Annually, we would go back to these sites and also conduct a full benthic assessment. So along the 8-meter transects, we would also take photos that could be used later in this program, Coral Point Count, which sort of spits randomized points in onto a frame, and you can kind of figure out your percentage coral cover and algal cover. We also used a chain tape technique to look at the rugosity, the complexity of the reef, and to max and min height of the reef. So we've been doing that for 5 years. And today I'm going to show you a snapshot of what the data is looking like. We've only just started working it up. So it's not a complete analysis, but it's just the initial findings. But some of them are quite interesting. So let's start with the fish. Over this 5-year period, we've counted some 41,000 fish. They belong to about 101 species from 26 families. And we've seen some quite surprising species turn up on these transects, like the redfish in the picture here. That's a big eye. And that species is not normally seen in 10 feet of water. It's usually seen on much deeper reefs. In terms of fish abundance, you might hypothesize that abundance would decline, particularly on reefs with lionfish. However, we saw an overall increase in fish across our sites, which was quite surprising. The fish in the image were responsible for that increase. So there were a few sites, both removal and non-removal, that had a recruitment of a huge number of grunts and tomtates, and swarms or clouds of thousands of fish. And that really changed the data. If you remove those fish from the analysis, you can see that fish numbers stayed about the same over time. And that's just in terms of abundance. We haven't looked at biomass yet. When you look at the fish community or assemblage itself, we were interested to see how that had been changed over time through the selection of lionfish predation. So we conducted some multivariate analysis using a permanova. This table just summarizes if the treatment sites were different to each other and if they changed over time. Interestingly, back in 2011, the non-removal reefs and the removal reefs were very similar in their fish communities. However, now they differ to each other and differ to how they were then. To look at this a bit more closely, we used some more multivariate stats, some simpler analysis, and just really simply, it shows you which fish are contributing most to the structure of that community. And we found on removal reefs, so where there weren't lionfish, that there were more herbivorous fish, like these striped parrotfish. So that was quite interesting. And of course, those fish play a key role in grazing and removing algae to allow corals to settle and recruit. So, what effect has those changes in the fish community had on the benthic environment? Well, looking at coral cover here, you can see the mean percentage of coral cover at the side there, and just a comparison of 2011 and 2015. Now, the reefs without lionfish, the pale bars there, showed significantly more coral cover than the reefs with lionfish, which makes sense. So that was very interesting. Also, in the algae cover, we saw a similar trend. Reefs without lionfish had less algal cover. Though interestingly, we saw reefs in 2015 overall, regardless of treatment, had less algae as well. So perhaps some sort of spillover effect from us removing lionfish from certain reefs. So let's have a look at the numbers of lionfish over time. So you've got mean number of lionfish at the side and years across the bottom. And the reefs with the lionfish denoted above them were the non-removal reefs. The only real difference here was 2011 and 2012, which were significantly higher in lionfish than the years 2013 and 14. Now, that almost looks like some sort of boom and bust population, which we often see with invasive species. So perhaps we're predicting in 2016 to be a particularly high year for lionfish numbers on our patches, but I guess we'll see. Interestingly, thinking back to that graph I showed you earlier with Stephanie Green and looking at the recolonization rates of lionfish, where we found that 4 months was the period in which lionfish recruited back to the reefs, back to the number they were at pre-removals. Here we see the dark orange graph, the dark line and the light line, in each year don't really differ to each other. So it seems like recolonization rates are happening faster than 4 months, and perhaps we should readdress the 3-monthly removals. So in summary, lionfish targeted culls on these reefs seem to be hugely beneficial in terms of increasing coral cover, reducing algal cover, and increasing the abundance of key grazers. But also that side note that we should not just establish monitoring programs and allow them to continue without any reassessment of how effective they are. Now, of course, targeted culling programs are great for certain reefs, but we can't be implemented on a wide-scale basis. What can be implemented is a lionfish fishery. And I'm sure this is not a new message to many of you. Sayings like eat them to beat them and eat more lionfish have been around for a while. However, there are some barriers to this fishery really taking off. And that's misconceptions around lionfish, that lionfish are poisonous, when in fact, they're venomous and perfectly safe to eat. And there's a lot of fear around lionfish as well, fear of being stung, particularly from fishermen, and the fear of loss of income. But, of course, fears and miseducation can be overcome, as we've been hearing all day, through outreach and education. So down at the Island School and the Cape Eleuthera Institute, we launched a lionfish fishery. We were buying lionfish from our locals for the kitchen to be consumed on campus. The youth say we paid local fishermen $11 a pound for fillets, which was on par with lobster, and $5 a pound for whole lionfish. And here we have one of our local fishermen, Nehemiah, just demonstrating how easy it is to remove a lionfish. They're abundant and pretty bold, so easy to spear. The fishermen just come into sight, they go to the kitchen, drop off their lionfish, get it weighed up, and walk away with a check. It's an easy system. It was piloted initially over the summer of 2014, which was the lobster close season. It was successful. We had about 500 pounds of lionfish brought in, and so we decided to open lionfish season all year round. These are the landings brought in over time, over last year, and you can see we had in total about 1,200 pounds, and there was no real relationship between when the drop-offs happened. They weren't bringing in more lionfish during closed seasons. We're not the only people doing this, of course. There's commercial operations out of Nassau here, like Lion King Bahamas, who are bringing in twice the amount we're receiving at the school and trying to work with all the islands, and still can't meet supply demands here in Nassau, which is good news. The other side of lionfish and how you can make them more profitable is to remove their fins. And these fins can be turned into beautiful jewelry. We ran some of the first lionfish jewelry workshops in the Bahamas, and they were a huge success. And now we have local artists selling lionfish jewelry on all the craft stores in Eleuthera, which is amazing. So just to finish up, so lionfish, we can cause the decline, whether it's through targeted removals or a wide-scale lionfish market. But all the countries in the invaded region and everybody living in them needs to be on the same page with this to be most effective. So you can help support the decline through the following actions. You could eat lionfish. If you're at a restaurant later and lionfish isn't on the menu, please ask for lionfish, help create that demand. And you can talk about lionfish with people who are unaware of the issue. And of course, you can wear lionfish. So with that, I'll finish up. Thank you very much for your time. Is there any questions?